Welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Have you heard of the Advanced Diploma in International Taxation, the ADIT Qualification? It's a qualification offered by the Chartered Institute of Taxation, the CIOT. Unlike the CTA, the Chartered Tax Advisor qualification, the ADIT solely focuses on international tax rather than just the tax of, say, the UK or other jurisdiction. With the world becoming ever more global, as tax professionals we are more likely to be exposed to or required to deal with international tax issues, so having some knowledge of international issues is becoming ever more important. But what exactly is meant by international tax, and how much international tax do you need in your role to make the ADIT to be worthwhile for you? Before speaking to this episode's guest, Catriona Loughran, I had so many misconceptions about these and many other points in relation to the ADIT. But in the episode, Catriona debunks these and many other myths about the qualification. Catriona is Head of Tax of Alexandra Mann Solutions with responsibility for tax compliance, planning and risk management across more than 25 countries. She is CTA and ADIT qualified and is also the founder of Extra Tax Training, which is a recognised course provider for the ADIT. She's well placed to provide advice and information about the ADIT, and in this episode she does exactly that. She covers whether it would be beneficial for you, the study options, and how it compares to the CTA in terms of difficulty and practicality. Without further ado, let's get to it. So just to start off then, could you, when people ask you what do you do, how do you usually respond?
I'm a corporate and international tax specialist, I suppose, to anyone in the know. So I have two roles. I work in-house as a head of tax at Alexandra Mann Solutions, and as well as that I founded my own tax training company, which is primarily focused on the ADIT exam.
Yeah, which is completely appropriate, obviously, for this episode, since that's what we're going to be talking about today. So what is the business that you have that provides ADIT training?
So it's Extra Tax Training, and it provides online ADIT training courses for 3 of the modules: Principles of International Tax, the UK module, and transfer pricing. So it was a way to make ADIT training more accessible to people who didn't have access to classroom training or who wanted to study online in a more flexible way.
Yeah, and that's really the reason I wanted to, I suppose, do an episode around ADIT, because when I was kind of doing my CTA and so on, I came across the ADIT qualification, and it did intrigue me a bit, but I found it quite difficult at the time to find, I suppose, useful information to understand the qualification and kind of what it would do to, I suppose, improve your career and benefit you in the long run. So could you just give a bit of an overview of what the ADIT qualification is and just some details around that?
Sure, yeah. So it's an international tax qualification. ADIT actually stands for Advanced Diploma in International Tax, and it's awarded by the UK Chartered Institute of Tax, like the CTA exam. It's a global qualification, so anyone in the world can sit it, and it is globally recognised. Everyone sits a core paper, which is Principles of International Tax, and then after that you choose 2 further modules to complete the qualification. You can get also standalone or modular certificates if you only choose to complete 1 or 2 papers. There is an option as well to swap one of the optional modules for an extended essay. So a kind of tax dissertation on a topic that you choose and is then approved by the ADIT exam board. So that's an option as well for people who have a particular specialism or are interested in a particular topic. It's a good mix of an academic and practical qualification, and it opens up tax to you. If you've trained and worked in UK tax, then it gives you the opportunity to explore into the international tax world and find out more about it.
Yeah, so I imagine then, is it just appropriate for people who work in international tax roles, or do you think it's also appropriate for people who may work outside of that and are just interested in learning a bit more about international tax?
Yeah, I think it's both, and I think it's difficult today not to work in international tax. I think the world has got a lot smaller. So I trained in accountancy practices in Northern Ireland, and we would quite often have exposure to international tax through our clients who were dealing in the Republic of Ireland. So you maybe be quite small businesses, but because of the border and the different jurisdictions, you're then into different tax laws. But now, since I set up my own business over a year ago, I've met so many entrepreneurs in different fields that are working globally because the internet has permitted them to do it, and we've seen so much of that in 2020. So it used to be that if you worked in probably a big four firm, you came across international tax, but now I think all tax professionals are coming across it more and more.
Yeah, and I mean, this might sound like a really broad question and maybe impossible to answer with any kind of divinity, but what is it that you actually mean then when you talk about international tax? Because I always feel like when I read that, I think it's more related to corporation tax more than anything, but would you use that term to encompass, say, employment taxes that are just crossing multiple jurisdictions and maybe the same for VAT, or is it more related to the corporation tax side?
No, it's right across kind of personal, corporate, and into VAT as well. So I suppose when I say international tax, I think of anything that has, well, for us in the UK, that goes outside the UK. So as you say, once you're crossing borders, so whether that's an employee who's going to work either permanently or temporarily in another jurisdiction, if you're selling goods or services cross-border for VAT, if you're starting to set up an office somewhere else, all of those bring you into international tax, bring you into the tax rules for second jurisdictions, and then you're interested in, well, how do those rules interact with the UK? That's when you get into things like the double tax treaties. And then part of the ADIT exam is understanding how those treaties work, what the framework is behind them, and giving you kind of an academic basis, I guess, for the work that you would be doing in the office.
So I think that's probably a really big myth then maybe that I was thinking, because I think that's probably a general consensus that people think it's only in relation to corporate tax, but by the sounds of it, then it literally is any tax that can just basically happen in a jurisdiction outside of the UK.
It is. So I mean, the principles of international tax, the core module, isn't focused on any one tax system. It's all about the framework of international tax, the OECD work around the Model Tax Convention, the treaty and commentary, the BEPS work that's ongoing. So it really is all about understanding what is the kind of framework for international tax, how does it work, and then if you choose, say you chose the UK as one of your modules, it's then a very broad syllabus that goes across both personal and corporate, and a little bit into things like VAT and customs. So I would say it's probably around maybe 60% corporate versus 40% personal.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not purely corporate. And I think for some people who only have a corporate background, introduction to topics like trusts and IHT can be a challenge. And then really from there, it's what other modules you would choose. So I know I had some students in the past who worked in a specialist expat tax firm where they did UK, US tax returns for individuals. So they were doing the UK module along with the US one to give them that overview of both tax systems.
Yeah. Interesting. So by the sounds of it, then really that first module of the qualification kind of sets you up to be able to work with international tax in any country almost. It gives you almost the fundamentals, the baseline to be able to do that. Is that right?
It does, yeah. I think it's probably the most academic of the papers. It's around understanding the concepts and being able to write essays on them. The question paper is split into section A, which is essay style questions, and section B, which is scenarios, which might deal with, say, an individual moving across borders, but it wouldn't be in any specific territory. It would be more about how does the treaty, what do the OECD rules say in that context. So definitely that's one of the reasons that attracted me to ADIT in the first place. I was doing international tax work, but I felt I didn't have that background in it. I was looking at double tax treaties, but I didn't understand what is the whole kind of rationale about this, how do all the pieces fit together, and I think that's what the ADIT gives you.
Yeah, so rather than kind of dabbling, you kind of get a bit more of the full picture, so you understand what you're doing.
You do, yeah. And I think especially with international tax, it's good to have the full picture, and it's good to have that exposure to to understand taxes across the board and not just your own specialism. So for me, my specialism is corporate tax, but it's important for me to understand, well, what is the employment tax implications of this? What does it mean if this person becomes resident in another territory?
Yeah, it's always dangerous, isn't it, when it comes to tax? If you have a little bit of knowledge, you can come out with a completely wrong answer, especially if you start making assumptions and stuff. That's one of the scary things about tax.
It is, yes, and there's so much information out there. I think now on the internet, you can sometimes be tempted to say, I could just Google that and find out the answer.
Yeah, we
all know that doesn't work, really.
No, I mean, you're destined to get the wrong answer if that's the approach you take. Mm-hmm. So just kind of coming back to, I suppose, almost any criteria that people need to have before doing the ADIT. Is there any criteria that people need to have, such as doing a previous tax qualification or a degree or anything like that?
No, there's no. The only criteria that the CIO2 list on their website is that you'd have an email address, because that's what you need to register as an ADIT student. So people do come from different backgrounds. The CIO2 tell us that the average age of an ADIT student is 36. So you say, probably a good 10 years older than the average CTA student, I'd imagine. Yeah. So typically people have worked in tax for a while, but that doesn't mean that that's, they're the only people who do ADIT. Some people do it because they want to learn more about international tax. Perhaps they're actually in a finance role and they say it is a good way into a tax qualification if they're working, say, in a multinational group. Some people do have an academic background in international tax, but this brings in more the practical elements of it. And I guess other people are just interested in it and want to learn something new.
So I think what we're talking about just leads on nicely into the next question then. So who do you think the ideal candidates are who would benefit the most from doing the qualification?
I think people who benefit the most are those who are either interested in working in international tax or interested in going abroad with their tax qualification and career. I think that's one of the key benefits of it. And I do get quite a lot of people from outside the UK contacting me saying they want to come and work in the UK, so they perhaps already have.
So at this point, Catriona's doorbell rang and her dog started barking like crazy. So we just had to give it a few minutes, allow the dog to calm down a little bit, and then we jumped straight back into it. So sorry about the abrupt stop in the interview there, but it carries on. But just before we continue with the episode, if you're really keen on progressing your tax career, then you may be interested in my free course designed to help you accelerate your tax career progression at a pace set by you rather than others. From the course, you will have an idea of which tax jobs will align with your career objectives and lifestyle goals. You will get an understanding of what you need to do to achieve the job of your choosing. You will create your own professional development plan to keep you focused and on track to achieving your goals. And your plan will be completely bespoke to you, and it can be as detailed or as brief as you like. It will mainly be there to give you some actual actions to undertake, and it will help keep you on track and accountable. You can enrol on this free course by heading on over to the website at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP17. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP17. And there'll be a button right at the top of the page where you can enrol on that course, as I say, for free. So without further ado, let's continue with the episode. So is there anyone that you think who probably wouldn't benefit, then it wouldn't be worth their time dedicating to the qualification? Is there anyone they think should probably, I don't know, say do the CTA instead, for example, or a different qualification?
Yeah, I think if you're early in your tax career, the CTA is probably a better qualification for you. Because it will give you that firm grounding in UK tax with, kind of oversight across the whole of the tax system within your chosen areas of specialism. I think it brings on more of those skills around interpreting tax legislation. So typically if someone is training in tax, I would suggest the CTA more than the ADIT, albeit was the kind of exception to that would be if someone is training in a particular specialism. So if someone has joined a firm to do transfer pricing exclusively, then the ADIT might actually be a better qualification for them, because if they've already chosen that specialism, it allows them to get a qualification in it quite quickly, and they might need to know, the kind of inheritance tax personal residence side of the UK corporate tax system in as much detail. And they might prefer to straight away go in and find out more about transfer pricing and how it works and be able to use it in their job.
Yeah, so it's definitely obviously going to be really beneficial for those who do work in an international tax role. And by the sounds of it, even if you don't, it's probably got to be more beneficial for you if you're a bit more experienced in tax, kind of along the lines of the average that you said before. I think it was 36, was it?
It was 36, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my experience. I did my accounting and tax qualifications sort of as a graduate trainee, and then spent another sort of 4 or 5 years working in tax, and then went back to do the ADIT qualification because I'd moved away from doing UK tax compliance into doing UK tax advisory with an international element.
Yeah.
So that's when I decided I would do it.
So we've already touched upon a few of these already, but so why do you think that doing the ADIT qualification is beneficial, and particularly how has it benefited you personally?
Yes, I suppose I did it when I worked for one of the larger accounting firms. Like I say, I was working in international tax, and I wanted more information about what I was doing. I wanted to understand, well, what are these international tax structures? How does withholding tax work? How does double tax relief work? How do the treaties work in practice? It's easy to take a treaty out and read it and say, okay, the state of residence has taxing rights, but what does that actually mean when you come to look at the transaction you're dealing with? So for me, it helped me there, and then it also helped me. I moved from that firm into industry, and I think again having that oversight, because my first role was European tax manager, so I was responsible for a number of entities right across Europe. So having that international side of things, so I didn't know what the tax rules were in France or Germany or necessarily the countries I was dealing with, but I knew what the international frameworks were around it, and more the questions to ask and how to kind of sense check the information that you're being given either by your local team or your local advisors.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's say there is someone though who is working in international tax already. Do you think that the job experience isn't enough, or do you think that it could be in certain circumstances, or do you think that everyone who works in international tax should do the ADIT qualification?
I think it's up to the person. There's so many different ways to work in international tax. So if you're working in a large firm, you might actually be quite specialist in international tax, whereas I suppose in terms of what I'm more familiar with these days is working in industry, and I think it is very well suited to people who work in industry because it gives you that, say it's the UK module, it gives you that broad overview of the UK tax system, or it gives you a good detail of transfer pricing knowledge that you're going to be using day to day in your world. So it just helps you understand what you're actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I don't think it's essential for people who work in international tax, but I think if you want some kind of background knowledge, more of an academic basis in what you're doing, but with a very practical bent, then ADIT is a good qualification for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And before you decided to do the qualification, did you ever have any doubt that it would be beneficial? Did you ever have any second thoughts before enrolling?
I don't know if it's second thoughts for enrolling. And it probably just thought I am interested in learning. I want to learn this. I don't know if I sort of thought about tangible benefits for my career. I thought, well, it's not going to hurt if I have another qualification. And it was, when I did it as well, it was very early in the kind of ADIT had only been going a few years, so not that many people knew about it. You wouldn't have seen jobs advertised where they were asking you to have the qualification, whereas now you might see it at least as an alternative or an add-on to CTA. I probably more thought about it once I was into it and into the reality of studying again. Like I said, I did my kind of accountancy and tax qualifications, as you're a graduate trainee straight out of university, you're still very much in that exam mindset. The firms have very good structure for that. They do it every year. They know the process to put their trainees through. I think coming back to it at a later stage when you're, maybe at manager, senior manager level, you have a more responsible job. It's harder to have that work-life balance and then throwing studying into the mix as well. So I think that's what I try to get across to a lot of people who come and ask me about it, that there is quite a time commitment required for it, and you need to make sure that you appreciate that before you start really to get the benefit out of it.
It's always the time commitment, isn't it? I mean, me personally now, I couldn't think of anything worse than enrolling on another professional qualification. Just because of the time commitment, it does take over your social life and your personal life for a while, doesn't it, whilst you're going through it? I imagine that's the same for ADIT as it is with CTA.
It is, yeah. I don't know if there'll be... there's quite a bit of interest in December 2020. I don't know if there'll be more interest as well in June 2021 as people's kind of social lives are severely restricted at the minute. They're thinking of something that they can do with their time.
True. Maybe a good time to do it now rather than wait. But we have already talked about a few things of kind of what you'll learn from doing the ADIT. But one thing that I would be particularly interested in personally is obviously, when you're doing the ATT CTA, you kind of have the opportunity to learn how to use the legislation, because basically it's going to benefit you vastly in the exams, and it's kind of teaching you that skill ready for the job. Is that part of the ADIT qualification as well?
I would say it's less so than it is ATT CTA. It will give you the skills around reading the OECD model treaty and understanding where you can go to help interpret it so into the commentary. And there is also quite a bit about case law and how international tax cases have been decided in the courts both in the UK and outside the UK. So that's why I think having either ATT or CTA or both is important at the early stages of your career to give you those skills. But I think then when you're ready to move on, I mean, certainly in the UK module, I teach it personally, and we do look at the legislation, and it is the same as CTA exams, and that you can consult the legislation in your exam, albeit obviously you don't have very much time to consult it. So it's really about knowing how it works in advance and applying it. But certainly it can help people who are outside the UK. So for instance, one of my students this year was a lawyer who didn't have lived and worked outside the UK, didn't have very much UK tax experience. And for him, kind of learning to read the UK tax legislation and getting to grips with it was an important part of the course. That's part of what he wanted to do from it.
Yeah. So what I'm kind of getting the impression of so far is that this qualification is entirely practical to give you the skills needed to actually use it on the job, rather than just kind of, I suppose, almost knowledge that you're never going to use again. It seems to be teaching you the skills to use as well as the knowledge.
Yes, to me it is a very practical qualification. You can obviously do more academic qualifications in tax, so like a master's in tax law or something like that, and I haven't done anything like that myself, but I imagine it's much more academic and much more looking at maybe the reasons behind CFC rules, for instance, whereas in the ADIT qualification you'll be learning about the CFC rules in the particular country that you have chosen. The questions certainly in the UK and the other jurisdictional papers would be very similar to what you'd find on the CTA advanced technical papers. So you're given a scenario, you're told who you are in that scenario. So whether you might be a tax manager writing a note for your tax partner, or you might be writing a letter directly to a client, and then what you're doing is explaining the rules to them. And a lot of it is about the interaction of rules, and I think that's where if I think about a UK tax professional, that's where it can be very useful, because it is a broad syllabus and it can give you that view outside your own area of specialism, which I think you need as you start to progress in your tax career, whether that's in a firm into kind of director partner roles where it's about understanding the full implications for the business and cross-selling and things like that, or whether it's an industry where you have to realize what the risks are for the business and identify them and take advice when you need to.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads on well to this actually, but it might be a slightly contentious question for some people, but where would you compare the difficulty of this against the CTA? It sounds like it might be similar, since these two papers kind of seem comparable in terms of how the questions are asked and the way you're meant to answer them. But which one would you say is more difficult?
Yeah, I think that is a difficult question to answer around the level of difficulty compared to CTA. I would say they're different qualifications. So for instance, if you take the CTA paper and if you're doing the taxation of major corporates, you will probably go into a piece of legislation. The questions in the CTA paper will likely be more detailed, as they will, for instance, if you're doing the kind of employment tax specialisms in the CTA. So you don't necessarily go into the depth that you would in, don't necessarily go into the same depth in the ADIT exam, but it's broader. So it's, having that appreciation around, well, what does this mean? How do the personal and corporate elements work together? How do you bring together these different elements of personal tax? So if someone's going to work in a different jurisdiction, but actually they've got a trust offshore, and how does that all fit together? And I suppose the other thing in terms of difficulty, this is a global qualification, and what I find this year is that you take a lot for granted when you've kind of come up through the UK system and you've say done your CTA exams and you've learnt how to answer the questions. If you're coming from a completely different educational background and suddenly you get questions that you've never seen before, that you're actually supposed to put yourself in the office and answer these questions as if you're writing to a client or you're writing a note for your partner, and you're not actually writing a kind of academic essay on a point. So I think in terms of difficulty, it really depends where someone is starting from. And I remember years ago when I was in the ADIT class, because I went to classroom based classes over in London, and there were some people who were much more experienced than me at that stage, but I remember what they struggled with is how you had to answer the question for the examiner. So it wasn't that they didn't have the knowledge, they had lots of knowledge on the topic, but sometimes too much knowledge on a topic is as dangerous as having too little, because actually, if there's only 2 marks for part of a question, then you just need to write your 2 sentences to get those 2 marks and move on. So a lot of it as well is about understanding how you need to do the exam, as well as learning the knowledge that you need to apply in the exam.
Exam technique, basically. Exam technique is going to be important for this.
It is, and so if you've done the CTA, you kind of have the exam technique. It's just a matter of bringing your mind back to how it all works. Whereas if you're coming from outside the UK, you're probably going to find it more difficult to understand what the exam technique is and what's expected of you.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've already touched upon this a little bit, but it would just be good if we can go into a little bit more detail. So kind of what exactly needs to be done in order to obtain the ADIT qualification? So I think you mentioned that you have to do 3 kind of modules. One of those doesn't have to be an exam because you can write an extended essay, but what
That's
else?
Right.
What else is included that needs to be done in order to obtain the qualification?
Yeah, so like I say, you need to do 3 papers in total, the core principles of international tax module. And after that, now it's actually very flexible to design and choose your other 2 modules. So popular modules would be the UK tax option, transfer pricing. There's a US tax option, which again is popular given the number of US multinationals. There's an EU VAT option, which gives you the kind of overview of the EU VAT system, looks at the VAT directive, things like that. And there is also an EU direct tax route. So when I started initially, I did the UK paper and the EU direct tax paper. And then a few years ago when I was working for HMRC, I set the transfer pricing paper, because you can set certain papers as a standalone basis, which is a good introduction to the qualification as well. Or if you're someone like me who already has it and then decides to add on a paper or 2 on top. So yes, there's 3 papers to do in total. There's 2 exam sittings a year, but only the most popular papers are examined twice a year. The ones that would be least or less popular are only examined in June. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, so when if you just did, say, one of the exams because you were just interested in learning about one of them, do you still get a certificate or something for that to demonstrate that you passed it?
You can, yes. So for instance, with Principles of International Tax, you can get a standalone certificate. For transfer pricing, you can get a standalone certificate, yes. So you can, payment of a small fee, you get a certificate from the Chartered Institute of Tax. And also, the student registration lasts for 5 years. So you could do a paper 1 year and then kind of leave it a couple of years and go back and decide to finish the qualification.
Yeah, so I imagine then you just got to make sure you do the modules that are required. So the initial principal paper and then one other module if you were to do that.
Yes, and I do think the Principles of International Tax paper is a good place to start because it's kind of the framework against which all the other modules work. So typically people would start with that one unless perhaps maybe they're working in something like transfer pricing and they decide to do that first.
Yeah. So let's say that someone does want to do this qualification then. I mean, what does the studying entail? What are the options to do it, like remote, classroom, etc.? How does that all work?
Yes, so with the classroom-based courses in normal times, they tend to only take place in major cities. So for instance, as far as I'm aware, there is only an option to do the courses in London within the UK. And it sort of would be the same in other places, in other territories. You might have to go to kind of a major regional city in order to get a classroom-based course on ADIT, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to look at doing an online option that would give people the ability to do it wherever they were based geographically. And also I think a challenge with it, because as we've said, people tend to be older, therefore they tend to be in more kind of responsible positions. Their employer is less likely to let them leave the office for an extended period.
Yeah.
So the kind of CTA model where you leave the office for a week or two to do classes doesn't work very well necessarily with the type of people who are doing the ADIT qualification. So I think quite a few people choose to do self-study. And then from there, I suppose there's a range through to getting support, whether that is kind of a pre-recorded type online course or into what we do, which is kind of live classroom courses with the option to watch the recordings then and the kind of tutor support that goes along with that. Or like we say, if people in normal times can go along to a classroom-based course near them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this might sound like almost a how long is a piece of string type of question, but how much time does it take usually to study towards just doing one of the papers? Is there kind of almost a recommended amount of study time you should put in to passing one of the exams?
Yeah, I think the CIOT do give a sort of guidance of the number of hours that they think it would take a student. Again, it depends where you're starting from. Are you starting from absolutely no knowledge, or do you have a reasonable level of knowledge of the subject? I suppose what I would say to people is you're probably going to be studying for 3 to 4 months in the run up to the paper, and you're probably looking at something around 4 to 5 hours a week. To get yourself through the course. So for instance, we run our courses as 2 hours per week, and I would say on top of that you're probably doing an hour of doing the kind of weekly assignment plus a couple of hours of reading, and that should then leave you in a comfortable position that when it comes to revision time, you've covered the course once and it's a matter then of doing question practice.
And how many months does that usually span across? Is it 2, 3, 4?
It tends to be, I suppose, 3 to 4. So the exams are kind of the second week in June and the second week in December. So the June exams are actually allows you a little more time to start in, say, at the start of February and work through to the start of June. I think with the December exams, people are still in holiday mode until kind of back to school time in September. So it tends to be a bit of a shorter run into them.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. And you've already touched upon this in terms of the study leave, and employers less likely to give it because those who sit it are probably more likely to be in a position where they have more responsibilities, a more senior role. But what about the costs? From your experience, do employers typically cost that, or is it self-funded?
Yeah, so I did a little survey last year about this time just to sort of see for people responded through LinkedIn and whatever, whether they got kind of exam support in terms of funding of study costs and or study leave from their employers. So I think quite a few people who came back said that they only got one of them or that they got neither. So I think it depends. I think where an employer recognises the benefit of it. So I've been lucky when I did it with both the accountancy firm and then the transfer pricing certificate with HMRC. My employer did support it in both cases, both in terms of paying for the costs and the study leave. I guess it's a matter of talking to your employer, kind of getting them to appreciate what it can bring to them as well as you, and that's always going to be easier if someone's actually in a tax role. If it's someone maybe in a finance role who wants to move into tax, then their employer might be less likely to fund it. And I think it could actually be that paying for the study costs is probably less of an issue for the employer than given a long period of study leave.
Yeah, you'd imagine so, wouldn't you? I mean, my employment tax brain is buzzing there because they're missing the trick really by not giving a very tax efficient benefit by paying for the training potentially instead of pay rises, etc. But yeah, it makes sense. I think probably where the role is related to tax and the qualification is clearly going to be useful to the employer. So kind of if someone was in a position where they were trying to justify the benefits to their employer, kind of what things would you be saying, do you think, to kind of justify them covering the costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for instance, if you're working for an accountancy firm, then that's another qualification that's going to benefit your employer and their clients. You've got someone who's got a specialist international tax qualification, and you can work with your employer to decide which modules would be best for you and for your role, so it's something that's going to have a clear basis day to day. And like I say, there's so few, I think, tax professionals now who aren't working with some element of international tax, so to give you that benefit. And if you chose, say, the UK module, you'd be able to say, well, look, I might be working as a personal tax specialist. Well, this will give me a view right across the UK tax system and how it works internationally, and therefore allow me to identify more opportunities for cross-selling to make sure that we don't miss any issues when we're advising a personal client. So one issue that quite often comes up, for instance, on the exam is where you have employees moving for the first time to work in a different location. You obviously need to look at the employment taxes, but also a key question you should be asking is, will that create a permanent establishment for that employer in the new jurisdiction? And that's the type of kind of training that ADIT gives you to kind of think around those issues and not just narrowly at your specialism.
Yeah, I think they're all really great points that people could mention to help justify covering the costs. I mean, I personally think it would be a no-brainer, but at the end of the day, it's not my money, is it, that's paying for the qualification? So
I mean, thinking, and obviously if the employer pays, that kind of the employee then has an obligation to do their best to get the qualification. That's the kind of trade-off as well, that you're going to put the time commitment into it to do the work and actually earn the qualification. Yeah,
makes sense. So have you got any final words you'd like to say to anyone who's considering doing the ADIT qualification based on your own experiences maybe?
Yeah, I'd say do your research, find out more about it. There is quite a lot of information on the CIOT website, and we have plenty of information on our website as well. Talk to other people who have done it and find out what they thought was beneficial. I'm always happy if anyone approaches me to talk about it, and I've talked to quite a few people about kind of CTA versus ADIT and what might be best, and to me it's always depend on the personal circumstances, and like I said, where people are earlier in their career, I've tended to point them more towards CTA because I think that's the better option. But I think ADIT is an excellent qualification. It is a really good blend of academic and practical. You can generally people sit one paper at a time. So you're talking about kind of getting the qualification over a year and a half or 2 years, which is doable. I think kind of 4 to 5 hours study a week for 3 or 4 months is doable. And because as well they have the standalone and modular certificates, it does allow you to kind of make your way through the qualification and potentially stop if you're finding that things have changed, or you've changed jobs, or things have changed in your life that actually you want to pause or stop there. So it is very flexible And, I think it can only benefit people's tax careers.
Yeah, all good suggestions there. Well, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast anyway. But just before we let you go, have you got anywhere in particular where people can go to find out more about you and your business that provides training for the ADIT qualification?
Yes, so you can look me up on LinkedIn, Catriona Loughran, or also follow Extra Tax Training on LinkedIn and visit our website, which is extrataxtraining.com. And we're always happy to have a chat to tell you more about ADIT in general and about our online courses.
Excellent. And there'll be links to those websites and also the LinkedIn profile in the show notes as well. So if you haven't caught that, you can find it in the show notes. Well, thanks very much for joining me today. I hope you found it enjoyable, and thank you for giving such useful information out to the listeners.
No, thanks very much, Jack. It has been very enjoyable.
Lots of food for thought there about the ADIT qualification, and if you're considering doing the qualification, I hope that you found the information and advice provided by Catriona helpful. Thanks, Catriona. So you can find all the links mentioned in this episode, including a link to Catriona's LinkedIn profile, the Extra Tax Training website, and also a page on the CIOT's website related to the ADIT qualification in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP17. That stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 17. The show notes also include links to 2 articles written by Catriona, which are how much does it cost to study towards the ADIT qualification, and which is the best qualification for your tax career, the ADIT or the CTA. Also, if you're serious about progressing and developing your tax career, you can sign up to my free course, which I mentioned earlier on in the episode, which is designed to do exactly that, at a pace set by you rather than others. A link to this will also be in the show notes. That's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points to help you improve and develop your tax career. Until next time.